The Duke charged the towers of, after months under siege, Toulouse strikes back, launching a historic counterattack that shattered and destroyed 30,000 Music Muslim invaders. 721, a year when the earth felt tight beneath marching feet, when the Muslim armies of Al-Andalus crossed the Pyrenees, carrying the force and confidence of an empire behind them. Their target wasn't a kingdom. It wasn't music, a nation. It was a single city standing alone before the storm to lose. What followed was no ordinary clash. It became a suffocating siege. Days of battering rams crashing against ancient music gates. Nights lit by fire and smoke and walls trembling under the weight of an army-convinced music that no fortress could withstand them. Across the plains below, shields slammed together, ladders' music rose, arrows darkened the sky, and the sound of battle rolled like thunder. And at the center of it all stood a city that refused to let an empire decide its fate. In the early 700s, Western Europe was split into two very different worlds. Towed south, across the tall Pyrenees Mountains, the same mountains that today divide Spain and France, the Umayyad Empire ruled almost all of the Iberian Peninsula. Cities that had once belonged to the old Visigothic kingdom had fallen one after another until nearly the entire region became known as Al-Andalus, governed from the powerful city of Córdoba. Life under Umayyad rule moved quickly. They expanded their roads, strengthened their armies, and looked north for the next opportunity. And from Córdoba, anyone who studied a map could see the same thing. The land beyond the mountains was rich, open, and politically weak. To the north of the Pyrenees lay Aquitaine, a large independent region in what is now southwestern France. At its center stood Toulouse, a proud and prosperous city ruled by Duke Odo, known later as Odo the Great. Aquitaine was not an empire. It was a collection of lands, villages, and lords who often argued but still shared one belief. They were free people, and they intended to remain that way. For years, a silent pressure existed between these two worlds. The Umayyads were powerful, united, and used to winning. Aquitaine was smaller, independent, and surrounded by larger neighbors like music, the Frankish kingdoms to the north. If the Umayyads ever decided to move to the mountains, Aquitaine would be the first to face them. Everyone in the region understood that, and so did Odo. The cause of the coming war was not dramatic. It was simple, almost predictable. After conquering Iberia, the Umayyad leadership wanted stability, clear borders, and complete control over the major trade routes. The lands north of the mountains, especially Toulouse, stood in the way of that plan. Odo refused to submit. He remembered how the Visigoths fell quickly, brutally, without mercy. He feared the same fate for his people if Aquitaine bowed its head. By the start of 721, tension had grown thick enough to feel in the air. Merchants whispered about scouts crossing the mountains. Travelers reported seeing banners with Arabic script along southern roads. Rumors changed every week, but the direction of the threat never changed. South to north, up the mountains toward Toulouse. In Córdoba, the man preparing this advance was Al-Sam ibn Malik Alani, the governor of Al-Andalus. Al-S was an experienced commander, calm and methodical. Hesiod reports from scouts, maps of Fivry Valley in the Pyrenees, and estimates of Aquitaine's defenses to him. The campaign seemed not just possible, but inevitable. He believed Toulouse could be taken quickly. He believed Aquitaine would fall soon after, and he believed the Umayyad Empire needed this victory to secure its northern frontier. So, Al-Sam gave the order. Across Iberia, soldiers began to gather. Cavalry units arrived from the open plains near Seville. Archers came from the cities in the east. Infantry marched in from every corner of Al-Andalus, men hardened by years of constant warfare. Blacksmiths hammered late into the night, sparks jumping from their anvils. Quartermasters packed dates, grain, waterskins, medical tools, and spare horse stack. Every village along the southern roads felt the vibration of the coming march. The plan was clear: cross the mountains, strike Toulouse, and break Aquitaine's independence in a single blow. By early spring, the preparations were complete. Tens of thousands of soldiers gathered in long lines along the valley roads leading toward the Pyrenees. Horses stamped the ground. Dust floated in the air. Standards bearing the Umayyad colors, white, green, and red, fluttered in the steady wind. At the center of the camp, Alsum stood over a final map spread across a wooden table. His commanders waited silently as he traced the main route to the mountains with the tip of his finger. North, north, he said quietly to Toulouse. The sun was still low when the first drums rolled across the valley. Orders echoed from one end of the camp to the other. Scouts mounted their horses and sped ahead. Soldiers tightened armor straps, pulled their hoods into place, and adjusted the weight of their shields. The Umayyad army was ready, and their long march toward Gaul was about to begin. The confirmation of the invasion riachetto loose at sunset, carried by a lone rider whose arrival silenced the city more effectively than any alarm. By the time Duke Odo stood before the report, the fading light had already turned the stone walls gold, as if preparing them for what was coming. The message contained no surprises, only the inevitable. The Umayyad army had crossed the mountain passes and was advancing steadily. Odo felt no shock, only a tightening in the chest, the weight off responsibility settling into its final shape. For years, he had warned Aquatanathat a storm was building beyond the Pyrenees. Now, the clouds had finally broken. He summoned his council at dawn. Instead of fear, the room held something quieter. The unmistakable realization that history was entering their doorway. Maps were unrolled. Reports were compared. Every path that led south told the same story. The approaching force was too large to stop in open ground and to organize a scatter with raids. If Aquitaine was to survive, Toulouse had to withstand the first blow. Odo understood that a city could be more than stone. It, clear as throat, could be a banner, a memory, a promise. If Toulouse stood, Aquitaine would rally. If it fell, no amount of soldiers would save them. High should have called it spread through the countryside, like a spark through dry grass. Not a speech carved into stone, but a simple demand that every village, every farmstead, every lord and freeman understood instantly. Aquitaine's survival depended on its people, all of them acting as one, and they answered. Men arrived in steady streams, farmers with hands hardened by years of soil, hunters carrying old spears, young boys whose faces had never seen war, but refused to stay behind. Fields where harvested early sow grain could fill the city's storehouses. Blacksmiths fired their forges day and night, reshaping tools into weapons. Women mended leather straps, carried stones-toed ramparts, and filled jars with salted dried meat for months ahead. It no longer felt like a city. It felt like a heartbeat. Fast, determined, alive, Odo walked among the people without fanfare. His presence alone was enough to pull tired shoulders straighter. He checked the reinforced gates, inspected the towers of Roman stone that guarded the streets, and watched the soldiers drill in the courtyards until their movements grew sharp and instinctive. There was no time for perfection, only readiness. From the highest walls, the view of the surrounding countryside shifted week by week. Traffic thinned. Merchants stopped arriving. The roads emptied except for occasional scouts racing home with dust clinging to their cloaks. Each report brought the same conclusion. The enemy marched with discipline, pressing forward without delay. Inside Toulouse, the atmosphere changed. Fear still lived there, but something stronger rose beside it. A shared certainty that they were defending not just a city, but everything they were. Songs of old Aquitaine were whispered at night. Families lit candles for ancestors who had survived other invasions long before this one. Even the air seemed to grow denser, holding its breath with them. As the days passed, Odo finalized a plan he had carried since the first rumors months earlier. While Toulouse prepared tone to the siege, he would gather a separate mobile force outside the walls, a hidden blade for the moment the Emperor overreached. He knew it was a risk. Heck knew the city would be alone for a time, but he also knew Aquitaine had always won through courage, not numbers. Then one cold morning, everything changed. A murmur moved through the watchtowers, then spread across the walls until even the children carrying baskets felt it. The horizon to the south had darkened, not with clouds, but with movement. Lines of cavalry, columns of infantry stretching farther than the eye could follow, standards rising and falling like waves. The Umayyad army had reached the plains before Toulouse. From the ramparts, the people of the city watched the formation grow, an immense shadow slowly settling across the land. There were no cries, no shouts, only a tight, breathless silence as reality took shape. The storm Odo had warned of was no longer distant. It had arrived, and Tulu stood waiting for first strike. During the night after the Umayyad army reached the plains, Tulus did not sleep. The enemy campfires burned in long organized lines, casting an orange glow that seemed to press closer with every hour. Even from within the walls, the people could hear it, the steady, disciplined rhythm of an army settling into position as if tightening a fist around the city. By dawn, the transformation was complete. What had been an open plain today before had become a fortress of its own. Tents stood in perfect rows. Supply wagons formed guarded corridors. Watchtowers built from stacked shields appeared along the perimeter. Everything about a Umayyad camp spoke of confidence, resources, and the intention to stay until Toulouse broke. Inside the city, the pressure thickened. Odo spent the early hours walking the inner streets, studying the faces of his people. No one cried, but the silence carried 1,000 unspoken fears. Mothers tied charms around their children's wrists. Old men sharpened tools that had never been meant for war. Life continued, viewed in a slower, tighter rhythm, as if the city itself had learned to breathe more carefully. By mid-morning, the Umayyads made their first move. Not an attack, not even a threat, but something more unsettling. They cut the roads. Units off cavalry fanned out across the countryside, blocking every path leading into or out of Toulouse. Watchfires were placed on ridges to signal movement. Scouts patrolled in silent, sweeping arcs. The message was unmistakable. Noon would enter. No one would leave. The city was now isolated in every direction. Toulouse had become an island in a sea of enemy soldiers. Odo stood on the northern tower, watching dust rise from the distant patrols. There was no immediate assault, no attempt to break the walls, only a tightening net. It was a different Kindaf warfare, one he knew well. The slow, suffocating method meant to grind an enemy down long, before a ram touched the gate. Still, he refused to let the city drown in fear. He ordered the grain stores opened and counted. Music. His supervised the rationing of water and food. He walked the ramparts with quiet, steady steps, pausing beside each group of soldiers, so they could feel his presence, not as a commander giving orders, but as a man sharing their burden. Meanwhile, the Umayyads continued their preparations with cold precision. They brought forward heavy timbers and long bundles wrapped in cloth. Soon, the distant clatter of metal signaled the construction of siege engines, though none were yet rolled toward the walls. They were building something larger, something meant to break more than stone. Watching from above, Odo sensed it. The enemy wanted to crush both body and spirit before they struck. By late afternoon, the tension had grown unbearable. The sky over Toulouse darkened with gathering clouds, but heat still rose from the ground, heavy and suffocating. Families huddled near doorways, listening for any change in the rhythm outside. Then the change came, not with noise but with quiet. The Umayyad camp, which had been filled with the clatter of construction and shouted commands, suddenly fell still. Rows of soldiers took their positions. Banners were raised in slow, deliberate motions. Archers climbed the newly built wooden towers. Engineers lined up behind massive, covered frames from the walls. Tolos watched them move like a single organism. Efficient, patient, terrifying. And then the waiting ended. Not a single drumbeat rolled across the field. Deep, heavy, absolute. The first assault had begun. It started with the archers. A wave of arrows burst upward, darkening the sky. The defenders threw themselves behind Merlin as arrowheads hammered into the stone with vicious force. Every strike echoed through the walls, rattling bone and nerve alike. Moments later, the siege engines lurched forward, not rams yet, but towering wooden screens that shielded entire squads of soldiers beneath them. The defenders could see the feet beneath the wooden walls marching in perfect step, moving the structure inch by inch toward the tallest sections of Toulouse's towers. From the streets below, residents heard a muffled thunder, the rhythmic pounding of hundreds of boots advancing under cover. Odo's captains shouted for boiling pitch. Cauldrons were hauled up by canes, sloshing hot liquid, as defenders braced themselves for the first brutal exchange. But the Umayyads were not rushing. They advanced steadily, shields up, formation tight, each step measured and controlled. It was like watching a storm roll forward. Not fast, but unstoppable. When the covered screens finally reached the base of the walls, to unleashed everything, stones crashed down like meteors. Pitch burst and sheets off fire. Slingers hurled lead bullets with enough force to shatter helmets. Yet, even as the first screen splintered, new ones slid into place behind them. The lines did not break, they thickened. Toulouse realized with growing dread that this was only the beginning. The first rams appeared. They were carried under long iron-plated roofs and were pushed forward by dozens of men. The sound with creaking underweight traveled up the walls, a deep, ominous groan that made the defenders' stomachs tighten. All across the battlements, soldiers leaned forward, gripping stones, gripping spears, gripping hope. And then the first blow landed, a single impact, heavy, echoing through the gate, through the ground, through the bones of every person inside the city. It did not break anything, but it marked the true beginning of a siege. By the time the sun dipped low, smoke drifted across the plains. Broken ladders lay scattered against the walls, and groans of the wounded echoed through the city. But the Umayyads did not withdraw far. They remained close, too close, adjusting positions, reinforcing their machines, preparing for nightfall. Toulouse had survived the opening strike, but only barely. And as darkness settled over the land, the defenders realized something chilling. The Empire was nowhere near finished. They were only warming up by the second week of the siege. Toulouse felt smaller than it ever had. The walls still stood, but something inside them had begun to shrink. The streets grew quieter. The markets shut down. People moved with a slow, cautious awareness as if every sound might echo too loudly as if the enemy might hear their fear. Outside the walls, the Umayyad camp expanded like a growing shadow. Watchtowers of timber rose higher. Siege platforms multiplied. Long trenches curled through the soil, marking new positions inch by inch. Soldiers rotated in perfect cycles, always rested, always ready. Inside Toulouse, exhaustion spread unevenly. The defenders on the ramparts looked older than they had a week before. Even the youngest soldiers walked with stiff movements, their muscles worn by endless tension. They no longer flinched at every distant drum beat. The sound had become constant, like thunder rumbling in the background of their lives. Rationing began quietly without announcement. Bread grew thin. Water was measured in careful ladles. Families improvised meals from scraps that once would have been thrown away. Still, no one complained. Their silence became a kind of armor, brittle, but necessary. Yet isolation was the worst of all. No rider could break out. No Masenga could return. Every road was sealed by Umayyad patrols whose speed and discipline made escape unthinkable. Even birds seemed to avoid flying over the enemy camp, as at the very air above it was dangerous. For Odo, the hardest burden was knowing that Aquitaine's reinforcements were out there somewhere, scattered, slow to gather. Unaware how much time Toulouse had left, he spent long nights studying the horizon, searching for any signal, any flicker of hope. But the distance remained empty. Music, and every hour, the enemy grew stronger. On the fifth day after the first assault, the Umayyads rolled forward a new set of Ophigens, larger, darker, reinforced with iron plates that reflected the sun like shards of broken mirrors. The defenders felt the shift immediately. These machines were not meant to test the walls. They were meant to shatter them. The first bombardment struck before noon. The engines did not throw stones. They hurled entire slabs of carved rock, each one landing with an impact that shook dust from ceilings and sent triples through the wells. The sound carried through the city like a deep unanswered question. People paused mid-step. Children stared at the vibrating walls. Soldiers tightened their grips on spear shafts slick with sweat. By nightfall, cracks had begun to appear along sections of the outer parapets. Nothing catastrophic, not yet, but enough to remind everyone that stone, even ancient Roman stone, could not endure forever. Odo increased rotations on the ramparts. He ordered repairs to the night, but every time a wall was patched, another impact landed somewhere else. It was a race the city could never truly win. On the seventh day, the enemy music changed tactics again. At first, it appeared harmless. Small units moving closer than before, music, carrying bundles off reds and leather shields. But Odo recognized the pattern instantly. They were preparing blind zones, dead angles beneath the walls where defenders could not aim. Once those blind zones were created, sappers could move in, digging under the foundations, undermining the stone from beneath. It was slow. It was methodical. It was deadly, and it terrified the defenders far more than any ladder or ram. The people of Tullus felt the shift, even if they didn't understand the tactic. They sensed the enemy tightening its grip in ways they could not see. Even the air grew heavy as though the city itself was being pressed from all sides. Inside the walls, tempers sharpened. Every argument, every mistake felt music larger, more dangerous. Mothers whispered prayers every hour. Fathers tried to speak calmly, though their eyes betrayed the pressure. Children watched adults more than the walls, searching for signs of hope that weren't there. But Tullus did not break. The spirit that held the region together for generations, stubborn, proud, fiercely independent, now wrapped itself around the city like a shield. No one spoke of surrender. Noon even suggested it. The city would hold or it would fall with its people standing upright. For Odo, that resolve was both a blessing and a burden. Heftled their trust like a weight on his shoulders, a weight he could not afford music to drop. As the sun set on the ninth day, Odo stood alone on the highest tower. Below him, the Umayyad camp glowed like molten iron, alive with movement and purpose. Far beyond it, beyond the hills, lay the source of his music, last hope. The Aquitanian force she had called weeks earlier. They were on their way. He had to believe that he had no choice. But would they come in time? A distant thud interrupted his thoughts. Another strike from the great engines. Dust drifted down the tower stairway. Somewhere below, a child cried until Amethyr held her close. Odo tightened his grip on the parapet. The wall still stood. The city still breathed, but the siege was growing darker, heavier, more suffocating with each passing hour. And Odo knew in the depth of his bones that the next phase of the battle would demand music. Everything Toulouse had left. The noose was tightening, and the true breaking point had not yet arrived on the 10th day. The siege stopped Baynah's slow tightening of a noose. It turned into a blade. Just before sunrise, Toulouse was shaken awake by a sound deeper and heavier than anything the defenders had heard so far. It wasn't the thud of stones. It wasn't drums. It was the roar of mass movement. Thousands of men advancing at once. By the time the lookout sounded the alarm, the Umed army was already shifting into combat lines. Torchlight flickered across shields as ranks tightened in perfect formation. A long murmur rolled through the city. Fear, awe, disbelief before dissolving into the frantic scramble of soldiers taking their posts. Odo was already on the walls. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his arms dramatically. He simply watched, jaw set, as the plain in front of Tullus transformed into a battlefield of further devastation. The first blow fell in the western wall. A team of sappers, hidden for days near the trenches, ignited a series of charges beneath the foundation. The explosion was small but strategic, just enough to shift an entire section of stone. Dust erupted upward in a violent burst. The wall held, but the message was clear. The enemy could strike anywhere at any hour. The real assault followed instantly. Hundreds of shields rose together, forming a massive shell that advanced like a living creature. Behind that wall-off iron came the rams. 3 of them, each swinging beneath a roof of layered timber and wet hides. Toulouse answered with fire. Burning pitch rained down in sheets, cracking against the shields. Slingers targeted the gaps, their lead bullets punching through exposed wrists and necks. Archers fired so quickly their fingers bled, but the Umayyads kept coming. The first ram struck with a violent jolt that shook dust loose from inner gadiuses. The shock ran through the stone, through the ground, through the defender's legs. A second impact followed, then a third, each blow a reminder that the gate to Luce's heart was mortal. On the eastern wall, another assault erupted. Tall siege ladders slammed against the battlements. Umayyad infantry surged upward, climbing 3 men at a time. Defenders met them with spears, axes, and stones hurled from desperate hands. The first Soldiero reached the top was thrown backward instantly. Music, crashing onto the men below. But more came and more. The wall turned into an arrow-frenzied struggle. Blades clashing, shields splintering, men grappling and tumbling over the edge into the chaos below. Odo moved along the ramparts, never staying long in one place. Wherever he passed, defenders redoubled their efforts, as if the sight off him anchored them to the wall. But I saw the truth. Tull was being pressed from every direction. The northern towers were struck next. Huge stones launched from rebuilt Yumed engines sarked through the sky like dark comets. Each one landed with concussion so powerful it felt like the earth itself lurched. One tower lost half its top in an explosion of shattered stone. Another had its entire parapet ripped away. Still, the defenders fought. They dragged broken beams across weak points. They braced trembling sections with anything they could find. Barrels, benches, overturned wagons. Priests carried water to the wounded and whispered prayers over men who no longer had time to listen. Outside the walls, the Umayyad push only grew stronger. Cavalry charged the outer streets, launching volleys of javelins over the parapets. Infantry rotated in fresh ranks. Music. Engineers rebuilt damaged screens in minutes. Archers adjusted their lines to exploit every weakness. IT was a rhythm, a brutal, unbroken rhythm designed to grind a lose into exhaustion. For a moment, the defenders nearly broke. A ram struck the main gati so hard that the inner beams groaned like a living creature under strain. The entire structure buckled. Splinters flew inward. Men stumbled back in fear. But then they surged forward again. They shoved supports against the gate. They slammed wedges beneath the beams. They screamed in anger, in terror, in sheer defiance. And the gate held barely. On the walls, the fighting reached its most desperate hour. Umayyad infantry managed to secure a foothold on the southern parapet. Several defenders were forced back. For a terrifying moment, it looked as though the wall would be lost. Oda bolted across the battlements with ass speed that belied his age. He reached the collapsing section music. Just as Seneme's soldiers spilled over the edge, the defenders gathered around him instantly. They struck in a single brutal wave, pushing the intruders back, step by bloody step, until the ladder beneath them cracked music and toppled, sending a cascade of armor bodies into the dust below. The cheer that followed was brief, breathless, fierce. But the fighting did not stop. Every direction burned with conflict. Every wall thundered with impacts. Every corner Toulouse trembled under the relentless storm of the Umayyad onslaught. Day became a blur. Music, noise, dust, blood, smoke until even the sun seemed unsure whether to rise or sit. Finally, as the sky dimmed to a deep bruised red, the Umayyad drums signaled retreat. Not defeat, a pause, a calculated breath. They pulled music back in perfect order, leaving behind wreckage, bodies, and the shattered remains of ladders and rams. Toulouse did not celebrate. No one had the strength. Men collapsed against the walls. Women dragged water to the exhausted. Every heartbeat felt music, like a victory borrowed from the edge of collapse. Oda stood alone for a long moment, gripping the parapet, chest tight with exhaustion. The wall still stood, the gate still held. But the truth preceded on him like the weight of the sky. The Umayyads had not thrown all music they had. That was only one day, one attempt. There would be another and another until something, stone, steel, or spirit, finally shattered. Toulouse had survived the first storm. Now it had to survive the next. The night after the great assault, Toulouse barely slept. The defenders lay wherever they collapsed, against the walls, on broken steps beside overturned barrels. The city was silent except for the soft crackle of torches and the distant hum of the Umayyad music, camp reorganizing for the next inevitable attack. Oda remained awake. He walked the ramparts long after the last torch dimmed, studying the battlefield with eyes that refused to surrender to exhaustion. He could feel it. An invisible thread stretched tight between the two armies. Point one more day of this, and Toulouse would break. Not from cowardice, but from sheer depletion. The walls were cracked. The gate was weakened. The people were starving. If he waited for the next assault, the city would fall. So Oda made the only decision that remained. He would not wait. He would strike first. Before dawn, he gathered the small mobile force he had hidden outside the city weeks earlier. The very risk he had taken before the siege began. These were not fresh soldiers. They were Aquitanian levies who had been moving quietly to the countryside, assembling in fragments, guided by messengers who slipped through shadows like ghosts. Now, in the dark hour before sunrise, they stood together at last, tired, music bruised, but burning with a quiet fury. Odo addressed them not with speeches but with presence. He mounted his horse with slow, deliberate movements. Showing them was not asking them to risk anything would not risk himself. They understood. As Toulouse watched from the walls, Odo and his hidden force rode out into pre-dawn darkness, circling the hills, disappearing behind the ridges where shadows swallowed everything. Inside the enemy camp, the Umayyads prepared their next strike. Engineers reported the rams repaired. Officers inspected ladders and shields. Infantry assembled in perfect rows beneath the stars. No one expected an attack from outside, not after 10 days of siege, not after breaking Toulouse nearly to its knees. As the sky lightened, the Umayyad commanders signaled their troops into formation music for the morning offensive, and then they heard a rumble from the north, faint at first, then growing, a vibration through the soil like the distant roll of thunder. For a moment they hesitated, and in that moment Odo struck. He came from the shadows at full speed, his cavalry charging downhill with terrifying momentum. The sound exploded across the plains, hooves pounding, iron clashing, men shouting in raw explosive unison. The Umayyads scrambled to form a defensive line, but the surprise was complete. Odo's riders smashed into their flank like a hammer, shattering a bronze shield. The impact ripped through the camp. Tents collapsed. Supply lines broke. Officers shouted orders that were drowned beneath the roar of charging horses. From the walls, Toulouse erupted in disbelief. The defenders cheered until their voices cracked, watching their duke tear into an army that had seemed unstoppable. The Umayyads tried to counterattack. Their commanders forced archers into position. Music ordered cavalry to swing around, attempted tourbillon formation, but the field was chaos. The trenches they dug now trapped their own men. The siege engines became obstacles. The rams that had threatened Toulouse only hours earlier now blocked their retreat. And Odo did not give them time to recover. He cut deep into the heart off their camp, striking at command tents, supply wagons, and officers trying tour group. The Umayyad formation bent, music, then twisted, then cracked. That crack became a fracture. The fracture became a collapse. It was not the wall-soft Toulouse that broke. Music. It was the confidence of the empire. The defenders, fueled by adrenaline and disbelief, opened the gates. A small force charged out to strike the disoriented Umayyads from the front, coordinated perfectly with Odo's assault from behind. Caught between two waves, the Umayyad army finally faltered. The lines dissolved. Fighters scattered. Horses panicked. Shouts became screams. Discipline evaporated. What had been the most feared force in Iberia became a mass of broken units trying desperately to escape the disaster unfolding around them. By midday, the plains outside Toulouse were unrecognizable, littered with abandoned shields, splintered ladders, and the remains of a siege that had come undone in a single morning. Odo did not pursue far. He knew victory had already been won, not through slaughter, but through survival. When he returned to walls, the people of Toulouse gathered in a trembling silence. They did not cheer. They did not shout. Many simply cried. Music cried with relief, with exhaustion, with the knowledge that they were music still alive. Odo dismounted slowly, his armor dented, his hands shaking with fatigue. But when he looked at his people, he stood straighter. Toulouse had endured. Music, not because its walls were strong. Walls could crack, not because its weapons were advanced. They were not. It endured because its people refused to let an empire erase them. In the days that followed, the story spread across Aquitaine, music, across Frankish lands, across the mountains and beyond. The city that should have fallen did not. The duke who should music have been defeated was not. The empire that seemed unstoppable had been stopped. Years later, when people spoke of the Battle of Toulouse, they did not speak only off walls or swords music or strategies. They spoke of resilience, of a small corner of the world that stood against music, a tide larger than itself, and of a dawn when a city believed it was dying, but instead witnessed music, its greatest hour. The siege ended. The memory did not in the months after the siege. Tulu's music rebuilt slowly. Stone's worry set, gates repaired. Scar's music stitched themselves into the city's memory. But something far more important endured than walls or weapons. A story of a people who refused Tochneel. A story of a city music that stood when every calculation, every prediction, every empire-sized assumption music said it should fall. A story carried by merchants, travelers, and soldiers' music until it crossed mountains, rivers, and kingdoms. News of Tulu's became more Thana, report of victory. It became Airminder, a warning music. That even the greatest powers can be stopped by the smallest places when their hearts are united. Across Aquitaine, families spoke of that dawn when the city rose from the edge of collapse. Music, across Frankish lands, lords whispered that courage could rewrite the fate-off nations. Across Alandaloo, commanders studied music, the defeat with unease, knowing it had shaken something deeper than strategy. And in Toulouse itself, the legacy lived in quieter ways. In the way music, children traced cracks in the old walls, knowing they were marks of courage, not weakness. In the way elders told the story around hearths, their voices soft but proud. In the way the city looked at its duke, not as a hero carved from legend, but as a man who had stood with them, bled with them, and believed in them when music, hope was a fragile thread. The Battle of Toulouse did not carve Aquitaine into an empire. It did not end music wars. It did not change the world overnight, but it did something rarer. It proved that identity, the shared belief in who a people are, can outlast armies, empires, music, and centuries. And long after the dust of the battlefield faded, long after the soldiers returned music to their fields, one truth remained. Tolo survived not because of stone, steel, or chance. Music. It survived because its people chose to stand together. That was its legacy, and that was its triumph.